start out in Magic, it's incredibly easy to be overwhelmed. There's so many tricks and moves and sleight of hand techniques out there that it's hard to know where to start. So today I want to show you the top 5 sleight of hand techniques that I use all the time so that you know that what you're practicing will help you in the long run. But this video is not just for beginners. Each of these 5 sleights has taught me an invaluable lesson, from how to recover from mistakes to how to make every single move you do invisible. So without further ado, let's jump straight in with the first one. The first technique is known as the lift shuffle. Now I'll show you what it looks like. Let's imagine we have the ace of spades on top of the deck. All we have to do is give the cards a bit of a mix and that ace of spades stays on top. Now my goal with this video is not to teach you these techniques. There are already a lot of videos and resources out there that will teach you these moves, but rather I just want to point you to them so then you know where to go and learn them. And if you do want to learn them, I'll leave all the links down below. Now the lift shuffle is a technique that I use in almost every performance I do. There's almost always a time where I need to give the cards a mix and control a card on top. And the lift shuffle is just perfect for that. But it also taught me a core lesson, and that is to develop muscle memory. Now there's this thing that people always say about self-working tricks, and that is you can take your focus off the sleight of hand and put it onto the presentation. But this is just as applicable to tricks with a lot of sleight of hand in them. It just takes a little bit more effort to get to a point where you can take your focus off the sleight of hand. And that's where muscle memory comes in. If you can teach your muscles to remember the technique, which means you don't have to consciously think about it when you're doing it, that means when you're in the moment, when you're performing for an audience, you can be fully present with them. Your brain can just think shuffle, and your hands can do the move without thinking about it. And this is one of those lessons that can take your sleight of hand to the next level. If you never have to worry about what your hands are doing, then not only can you be more fully engaged with your audience, but also they're not going to worry about your hands as much either. If you're constantly looking at your hands every time you execute a move because you have to get it right, then your audience is going to be focusing on your hands too, and then it's going to be much harder to get away with the sleight of hand. Now this is particularly relevant to the lift shuffle because with every false shuffle, attitude is the most important factor. You could do a really sloppy false shuffle and it will still look great as long as your attitude conveys that there's no control about the cards. And so developing muscle memory, I think, is an essential technique, especially for the lift shuffle, because if people don't think that you're controlling cards, then you'll get away with it every time. So that's the lift shuffle. It's a great move, but the next move I want to talk about is the cull. Now the cull is a great move, but one of the reasons it's so great is because it's so versatile. There are so many ways you can use it. A lift shuffle is pretty binary. You're pretty much just going to use this to control a card during a shuffle. But the cull, I mean, you can use it to find a card, you can use it to switch a card, you can use it to move a card to a set position. There are so many ways you can use the cull, and that's what brings it to this list, because it is just one of the most versatile techniques out there. Now the cull also taught me an important lesson, and that can be best summed up by a quote from Ussie Wind, where he said, "It's not an out, it's an outcome." And this is a philosophy that he has that I really like. It basically means that if you screw up in a trick and you have to go into recovery mode, that recovery mode, you shouldn't treat that like it's an out or like it's a secondary effect. It's not as good as the first one. Because in the spectator's mind, they don't know when the trick has gone wrong. And that's what makes Magic such a unique art form. It can look like everything is going wrong when nothing is going wrong. It can look like you have no control when in reality, you have all of the control. And the audience knows this. And so often when they see something go wrong, even if it has legitimately gone wrong, they're going to assume that this is all part of the trick. And so you can use that to your advantage, and the cull is a perfect way to do this. If you're completely lost, they've chosen a card, you don't know what it is, there's a really easy way to get out of it. You can say to someone, look, before I started, I put a card in my pocket. What was the one that you said? And then as soon as they name the card that they saw or that they chose, you go through, you cull it from the middle of the deck, you can palm it off, and then boom, it's now in your pocket. And so the cull is one of those techniques that's going to allow you to get out of pretty much any situation that you're in. And that's a super important lesson, and it's one that I've learned many times, which is that often when something goes wrong, it can actually turn out better than how you originally intended it to go. So that's the lesson from Ussie Wind and from the cull. It's not an out, it's an outcome. The next move on this list is the classic pass. Now the classic pass is a technique that allows you to take any card you like from the middle of the deck all the way to the top. Now this move is not a burnable move, which means that if people are looking at this, they're going to see something. There are some people out there with pretty much invisible classic passes, often exhibition style classic passes, but this is a move that's going to require some misdirection, and we're going to get onto that in a bit. But the reason I included it in this list is because it is by far the most efficient and quick way to get a card from the middle to the top. And that's because you are literally just cutting the deck at a super fast rate. Now, one thing that I've learned over the years, and this is a tip if you're trying to learn the classic pass, is that it's not all about speed. I used to practice my pass so that I could get it ridiculously quick. But there's a problem with this, which is that your hands signify that a move is happening. You can see with my hands right now, if I do the pass, I'll get that ace to the top. Even though you can't really see the move happening, you can only really see a flicker of the cards going past, my hands are doing this jerky motion. And so even if a spectator doesn't see it, they're going to feel that a move has happened. So the classic pass is also about being soft with the cards. It means doing it in a way that is slow and smooth rather than super quick. So that's a super important tip, but that's actually not the lesson that I learned from the classic pass. The classic pass taught me that all good moves take time. Sleight of hand is really difficult, and you can't learn it overnight. And in fact, even with months of practice, a move can still look terrible. And so the classic pass taught me that it's going to take years, not months, to perfect some of these techniques. And some of them never really get perfected. There are many people who work on a classic pass for their entire life, and they're still always honing a very small detail. And that's what I love about it, is that you're never done. Just like any art, there's always improvements you can make. And this lesson is super relevant for the classic pass. This is not a move that you can master straight away. It's going to take many years to get your hands used to the feeling of the move and all the little subtleties that make it up. Just as kind of a river carves out rock over time, your hands can also carve out a pass over time. You can slowly mold it to your hands and get more and more comfortable with it. I've still got a long way to go on mine, but if I look back to a year ago, I can already see massive improvements. So just remember, when you're practicing sleight of hand, all good moves take time. The next move on this list is the top change. Now, the top change is an incredibly useful technique. It allows you to switch a card for another one from the top of the deck, just like that. Now, just like the classic pass, this is not a move that you can do while the people are looking at your hands. A lot of people try to build top changes into a trick by kind of reaching over like this and doing some kind of big, relaxing motion like this. And although these are fine to start off with and can work in certain situations, I think there are better ways to cover the top change. And that's where the lesson came in, which I learned from the top change, which can be best summed up with two words: look up. You see, it's very common when you're practicing sleight of hand to look down at the move so you can see how well you're doing it. But in the real world, you don't want to be looking at your hands when you're doing the techniques, because whatever you look at, the spectators are also going to be focusing on. And this is why misdirection is, in my opinion, one of the most important things you can master as a magician. If you can direct an audience's focus to anything you want, then you never really even have to make your moves look good, because no one's going to be watching them. Now, I'm not saying you should be sloppy with your sleight of hand. Pretty much every move benefits from a smooth action. But what I'm trying to say is that in order to make these moves invisible, you need to direct attention away from the cards. And the easiest way to do that is to make something else more interesting than the cards in your hand. Whether that's something you're saying, whether it's a question you ask them, whether it's a prop you introduce, as long as you get their attention away from your hands, it gives you space to execute the move. Now, the important thing with this is to not push it too far. You don't want people to be looking away from your hands so long that they forget what it was like before. Let's say you start with the ace of spades in your hand and you need to do a top change for the five of diamonds on top of the deck. You could tell a joke, they start laughing, and then they're looking around at each other, and this seems like the perfect time to do the top change. But the problem is you've lost control of the situation. They're laughing and they're not looking, but they're also laughing for quite a while, which undoes this image of the ace of spades being in your right hand. And so when they look back and they see it's changed to the five, there's not as much mystery there, because they weren't completely convinced that this was the ace. And so the key and this is a lesson that I learned from a friend of mine, the key is to get them to look away for the smallest amount of time possible before looking back. And so then in their mind, when they think back to it later, they're going to remember that they never looked back, when in reality there was a split second where their focus was elsewhere. So with the top change, this would look like asking them a question, doing the move right as they look up, and then immediately bringing the focus back to the card. And so in their mind, this has never changed. You didn't do anything because that moment where you switched it is erased as they thought about that question. So that's just one strategy to cover your moves with misdirection, and that's kind of ask a question and then direct the attention back to your hands. Obviously, all of this requires subtlety, and I could go on about this lesson for a long time. It's one of the most important things I've learned over my years doing magic. And I also have some resources that I'd recommend looking at for that, so I'll leave those down in the description if you want to learn more. But that was the top change, and one of the most important lessons I learned, which is look up. Now we're on to the last technique here, and this is one of my favorites from this list, and that is the top palm. The top palm allows you, in the action of squaring the deck, to get a card from the top of the deck into your palm. Now this is one of the most powerful weapons in your arsenal as a sleight of hand artist. It's also one of the more difficult areas of card magic. So it's important to really practice this and practice being natural with a card in your palm. Now I have a lot of thoughts and tips about this, but the biggest one is just to go around practicing having a card in your hand. When I was at school, I used to literally walk around all day with a card in my hand. I'd swap it out because the cards would get mangled and horrible, but the idea was to have it in your hand. Sometimes I'd switch hands, sometimes I'd switch to different palms, and the idea was to totally conceal the card throughout the entire day. When you do this long enough, it makes your hands completely used to having a card in your palm. There's no guilt, there's no uncomfortability with having a card there, and so it feels supernatural, and that feeling is conveyed when you're performing. So palming is one of the most powerful weapons you can use, but it's also one of the most difficult to master. And as a result, there are a lot of techniques for getting a card into your palm. And that kind of ties into the lesson that I learned from palming, which is to cover your bases. So what do I mean by cover your bases? Well, sleight of hand is an incredibly diverse craft. There are literally thousands of techniques to choose from. And so I find it's incredibly helpful to learn a whole lot of different ones that each have their own niche use case. I'll try to show you what I mean in an example. So a little while ago, I set a challenge for myself to learn a technique to get a card into both a palm in my left hand or a palm in my right hand from any position in the deck, which basically means I had to learn a technique to get a card into my palm from the top, also a card into my left palm from the top. I had to do a card from the middle, so getting a card from the middle into my left palm, so that's this technique here, the diagonal palm shift. There's also trying to get it from the middle into your right hand, and that's where you use a traditional side steal. And then also from the bottom, I would try to get a card from the bottom into my left hand, like this, and also into my right hand. Now, I do need a lot of practice with a lot of these techniques, and I think a lot of them are flashing for the camera. But the point was to try to practice these so that no matter what situation I was in, I could always palm a card. Go crazy with this. There are hundreds of palming techniques out there, and there are also a lot of different palms. You could try to learn a way to get from every position into a tenkai, or a longitudinal, a lateral palm, a gambler's cop, and you can do the same for both hands. And so there are a lot of ways you can try to take this challenge. And the benefit of learning a technique which allows you to go straight from the middle to a palm or straight from the bottom into palm is that you eliminate the need for a control. You can take that card immediately from where you want it straight into palm with no need for a secondary motion. And obviously the more sleight of hand that you eliminate, the cleaner it's going to look. Everything is going to look completely normal, as if you are just taking the deck, handing it out, or doing whatever you want. So that's kind of the lesson that I learned from palming especially, is try to learn a whole lot of techniques that cover all of your bases. So then whatever situation you're in, you can always do what you need to do in the most efficient way possible. And so if you think about it, that lesson seems to undermine the whole purpose of this video, which is to find 5 techniques or 6 or 7 techniques and really master them, really get good at those techniques before you move on to others. And I do recommend you do that. I recommend taking these 5 techniques, maybe adding another couple in, like a double lift or a force of some kind. Try to master these techniques, really practice them. Don't worry about all of the little move monkey things. And then you can move on to these other techniques, these other crazy palms and all these other things, because you've got a good core base. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and maybe you've even learned something from it. I know advice is always more useful for the advice giver, and this video has been a super helpful way for me to distill some of the things that I've learned about sleight of hand into kind of 5 nice lessons. If you did enjoy it, and maybe if you got something from it, feel free to subscribe and let me know what you thought in the comments. What are your top 5 favorite moves that you like to do? Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.